Welcome to the Books and Music Show. Welcome to the Books and Music Show. This is the Books and Music Show, and we're airing on Saturdays at 12:30, usually. You can catch us on other times, and we're also on the net. You're on air, Gerard, and we're going to be talking about, is it the Supremes? We're going to talk about the Supremes. Okay, take it, Gerard.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Yeah, today we're going to be talking about current affairs and what's been consuming the news over the past week, which is the retirement of Justice Anthony Kennedy, an associate justice on the Supreme Court who's been there for the past 3 decades. He was appointed by Ronald Reagan in the late 80s. And I think in order to talk about this, we can't just speculate on who might replace him and the political battle that would ensue once a choice is made, which is coming up pretty quickly. I think in the next week, the president is going to name a nominee. He's already whittled it down to a handful of choices culled from a 25-person list that was circulated earlier that's of nominees that have been vetted by the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society. But I think before we discuss that, we have to explore the historical context to the Kennedy resignation and the nomination of his eventual successor, because it set the groundwork for the Supreme Court battles and political battles within the Senate over the past 30 years. Because what really shaped the process, and I know a lot of people, it's generally regarded with disdain, the political process that goes into naming and confirming or rejecting a Supreme Court nomination. And it all stems from the man who was nominated before Anthony Kennedy, Robert Bork. Robert Bork was a circuit judge. He was, a long time ago, he was actually pretty famous for being the Solicitor General during the Nixon administration and being appointed as acting Attorney General after his superiors had resigned under pressure from Richard Nixon during the Watergate scandal. William Ruckelshaus and the Attorney General who was the Deputy Attorney General, he and his superior had both resigned rather than serve under Richard Nixon. And but other than that, he was known, subsequent to that, he was appointed as a circuit court judge and was really known as a distinguished jurist with very well-reasoned opinions. But he was also very controversial for people who disagreed with the conservative originalist slant, or I shouldn't say slant, but the originalist interpretation of his court opinions. So he attracted a lot of controversy when he was nominated by President Reagan to be a justice on the Supreme Court. This was after Justice Scalia had been confirmed by an almost unanimous margin. He was seen as a very appealing candidate because of his Italian-American Catholic heritage, and was pretty much confirmed by acclamation. Bork's nomination, on the other hand, was the complete opposite in terms of the reaction by the U.S. Senate, particularly by the Democratic majority in the U.S. Senate and people on the Judiciary Committee like Joe Biden and the late Senator Ted Kennedy. And I think this is the crux of the issue of why so many people are aggrieved by the way the Supreme Court, the political battles that go into choosing a justice play out. Because prior to this, the deliberations were almost exclusively related to the judicial temperament of the justices, their experience, the sophistication and intelligence in their opinions, their dissents, and their majority opinions from lower courts. And there were when nominees were rejected, for example, Abe Fortas, when he was nominated as a Chief Justice, and that nomination was scuttled, when it was scuttled because of intense cronyism and nepotism, corruption allegations, and that was usually the standard for rejecting a nominee for the Supreme Court or even for lower courts. Most lower court nominations to appellate and circuit court district judgeships weren't even opposed. The ideological leanings or the philosophical leanings of the judges weren't really even scrutinized. So this was the standard up until, with some exceptions. For example, Richard Nixon nominated 2 justices who were rejected because they were Southern conservatives. But for the most part, judges were given a lot of leeway if they were otherwise qualified to serve, if they had a record of distinguished judicial opinions and service in the federal judiciary or in other capacities, like, for example, Robert Jackson, who was an attorney general and the head of the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal for the United States, or William Howard Taft as another example. But these people were considered based upon the merits of their record, whether or not they were conservative wasn't really taken into consideration. And that all changed when Robert Bork was nominated, because he had the temerity to actually defend his philosophical and judicial beliefs. Even if it courted controversy, he explained why he thought cases like Griswold versus Connecticut or Roe versus Wade were wrongly decided, and he delineated the reasons why he felt these were poorly reasoned judicial opinions. Instead of trying to skirt the issue or evade during his Senate confirmation hearings, he was very clear and direct in responding to the Senate's very pointed questions. And unfortunately, that that gave his opponents an opportunity to savage him, both in the press and using allies like Nan Aaron in the Alliance for Justice and People for the American Way and other groups that were that opposed conservative values and wanted to keep the judiciary very tightly controlled. And in their corner, they used Bork's openness to kind of decimate him in the press with the help of certain journalists, and it transformed the way judicial nominations are looked at, and the way they're argued and lobbied for, both within the White House and within Congress. And that you have the famous Ted Kennedy speech accusing Robert Bork of a whole list of theoretical transgressions against the Constitution for disagreeing with his political beliefs on specific issues like abortion or antitrust law. And the result of all of this was that the proximate result was that Robert Bork's nomination went down into crashing defeat. Several Republicans defected and voted against him. And I think he only received something on the order of 40 votes for confirmation, or 42 votes, which it was almost unheard of for a qualified judicial nominee. I believe even the American Bar Association was influenced to give him a lower rating than it otherwise would have, and that it gave him for previous lower court nominations. So the whole process was intensely politicized, and the result, as I said, the immediate result was that Robert Bork's nomination was defeated, and that President Reagan had to find another nominee, who turned out to be Douglas Ginsburg, also a distinguished jurist whose nomination was sabotaged by the revelation that he had used marijuana in the past. So he was forced to resign, and ultimately the person they decided to replace the Bork seat was Anthony Kennedy, someone who was thought to be conservative but did not have a long judicial paper trail and wasn't outspoken on any of these issues. And unfortunately, that became the primary method used when Republicans were in the White House and had to find a judicial nominee who could survive Senate, the new standard imposed by the U.S. Senate. And it resulted in a lot of nominees like David Souter and people who essentially refused to articulate their judicial philosophy because it would incriminate them in the eyes of their opponents. So another result of this was you had a very cryptic, almost, I would compare it to the way you had Kremlinologists, these people who were journalists or scholars and were brought onto talk shows in order to analyze esoteric, kind of minute body movements, or the posture, or the inclusion of certain people from the Soviet Union when they were making diplomatic overtures, and try to use that in order to impute something about the USSR's foreign policy. So you had something similar happen in terms of the judicial nominees for the Supreme Court. You had law analysts and professors trying to divine what the judicial philosophy of someone was who was never going to explain it until they actually got on the Supreme Court. And this was just I think a terrible development, because the public learns nothing about how different constitutional interpretations differ, and what the reasoning is for the Supreme Court when they do make these decisions, and what prompts them to hold certain constitutional principles. It's basically a cat and mouse game of senators, Democrats and Republicans, asking questions that they know they'll never receive the answer to, and the nominee going through a pro forma ritualistic, kind of dance where they won't actually admit what they believe. And the Anthony Kennedy nomination was the epitome of this, because Anthony Kennedy became a one-man Supreme Court. You had people presenting their briefs to the Supreme Court, petitioners, and crafting it specifically to appeal to Anthony Kennedy, one person on the 9-person Supreme Court. You had people designing their arguments to appeal to someone who didn't have a well-defined judicial philosophy, who just essentially would decide what he believed in based upon some unexplained consensus that he believed society had reached on a particular issue, whether it was abortion or gun control or the Second Amendment or the Fourth Amendment, the right to privacy. None of these areas of grave constitutional import were decided based upon a firm, implacable judicial philosophy. They were all designed based on what Anthony Kennedy thought historians would appreciate 20 years or 30 years after he retired, or what journalists, contemporary journalists, would support and give him praise for. So I think the Kennedy resignation, and it's typical of Supreme Court justices only to retire after reaching their late 70s or 80s, or even older. So the fact that Anthony Kennedy is retiring at this age isn't that surprising, nor is it that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is still on the Supreme Court despite her advanced age. It's a lifetime appointment, and for someone who has dedicated their lives to being a judge, relinquishing that power when you've been appointed to the most important judgeship on the entire planet is something they're loath to do. But going back to Anthony Kennedy, I think his resignation is just an illustration of how far we've gotten from the original point of the Supreme Court, which was to serve as a co-equal branch of government and as a check when the two other branches are engaging in something that's blatantly unconstitutional. Now you have essentially what you have is 9 high priests and priestesses who pass pronouncements on very complex, intricate constitutional questions and expect their pronouncements to be greeted with universal acclaim. And Anthony Kennedy is just the most prominent example of this. But you can see some of Kennedy's persona persisting in the current Chief Justice John Roberts, who's now thought of as the Anthony Kennedy. Only he's even more powerful because he's the Chief Justice and he can assign decisions, and now he can determine decisions because he will be the swing vote if the nominee who replaces Anthony Kennedy is in the line of Neil Gorsuch or Samuel Alito, a very dedicated originalist justice. Now the Anthony Kennedy role has devolved onto someone who actually will be the most powerful man on the Supreme Court and one of the most powerful men in the country's political system. So I think that's one of the things that people haven't explored sufficiently when they're discussing the sort of horse race aspect of this debate and discussion about who will replace Anthony Kennedy, who will be the ninth Supreme Court justice. I think that this is one of the things that gets underplayed because it really forces us to focus on whether or not what we've been doing for the past couple of decades has worked. And I don't think it really has worked, even though this is the mode that we've chosen to adopt. And you can see criticisms of that, not only from former nominees like Robert Bork, but excuse me, and law professors like Lawrence Tribe, and liberal law professors like Lawrence Tribe, and conservative ones as well, who have much the same criticism of the sort of kabuki theater that goes on when you're talking about Supreme Court nominees, because every nominee since Bork, including Kennedy, has veiled his intentions from Souter to Breyer to Ginsburg to Alito to it runs the gamut. But basically every nominee since Robert Bork, including Anthony Kennedy, has followed the same script in order to be nominated, in order to be confirmed, which is kind of disappointing when you think of someone spending their entire life aspiring to be a judge on the Supreme Court, and when they get to be nominated, they completely obfuscate, or perhaps not dissemble, but they shroud their views simply to achieve this goal, which is kind of disappointing when you put it in that context. And whoever replaces Anthony Kennedy, I'm sure will have a firmer underpinning of their view of the Constitution and how to apply it in real life. Some of the nominees from the list are really distinguished jurists like Dianne Sykes and William Pryor and Amy Coney Barrett. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of debate about what sort of qualifications they have. Again, even from people who support these nominees, you hear a lot of what I would consider tangential discussions. For example, how old they are. Dianne Sykes is 60, and that has been raised because people, of course, assume that you want to nominate a Supreme Court justice who will be very young so they can stay on the court for decades and decades, issuing opinions to your liking, which again is a really distorted view of what a really kind of bizarre conception of what the role of the Supreme Court is. I don't think you I don't think the founders viewed it simply as a way to put your political imprimatur on future generations of Americans and to impose your will on future generations based on how long you expected the Supreme Court justices to live. Of course, they lived. People didn't live as long back then, but I still think there was a general agreement that the Supreme Court was designed for a more noble role than simply shaping the political political framework of future generations. But you don't hear much discussion of that, of the more important issues surrounding, and the more important principles surrounding this nomination. And I don't expect that you will hear that in the next week and in the subsequent weeks when we discuss whether or not this nominee will be able to be confirmed or how many votes he or she will receive. And you can all trace it back to the nomination of Anthony Kennedy, but even earlier than that, the nomination of the man who he replaced, Robert Bork. And Robert Bork has actually written a good book about this very issue, not necessarily his particular nomination, although it is explored, but how to look at the Constitution and apply it in reality rather than simply an abstracted notion of what the Bill of Rights and the amendments to the Constitution and the Constitution mean. And I think that's one of the things that people should be doing, is to actually look at legal scholars and the opinions of people who have studied the Constitution and the law and understand what this system means. We get caught up in these sort of superficial debates about how judges are going to vote as if they're congressmen or senators and not representing a third branch of government, which is meant to write and craft decisions based on their interpretation of the Constitution, a document which transcends kind of sort of temporal political divisions, or it's something that people really need to investigate and try to change their attitude about, because I think too many people are wedded to the notion that the Supreme Court is just simply a smaller version of Congress or the party in power. And I think it's a really wrong-headed perspective. In any case, that's my view. Feel free to disagree with it if you want. And I'll be back next month. And we can, perhaps by then we'll have a new Supreme Court justice, and we can talk about what implications that has for the country at large, not just the judiciary, but the republic in general and citizens. And I would urge people to get out and investigate these issues and go beyond newspaper headlines or the CNN news tickers or RSS feeds, and actually look at these issues from a deeper perspective. In any case, that's it for this books and music review. Hopefully, we'll speak to you soon in the near future. Goodbye.